The great failed romances of the 20th century. Boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives. The great failed romances of the 20th century. Let's go hear about how they ruined their lives.
Welcome to the Great Failed Romances of the 20th Century. I'm singer-songwriter and historian Teddy Gray.
And I've got a 7-year itch. I should really get that checked out. Sam Kaufman. So Teddy, which glamorous gaggle of Gaga... Who are we talking about? Who are we talking about today?
Making her second appearance on the show, it's Miss Marilyn Monroe and another one of her beaux, Arthur Miller.
But Teddy, Marilyn Monroe's a stone-cold fox, and Arthur Miller's a notorious uggo. How did this unlikely pairing happen?
Well, Sam, if you shut up, you'll find out.
All right.
As we covered earlier on this show, Marilyn Monroe had more than her fair share of notable lovers. JFK, Joe DiMaggio, Marlon Brando. But the man she chose to be her third husband was perhaps the most shocking.
The man with a face only a mother could love, Arthur Arthur Miller.
Before meeting Monroe in 1951, Arthur Miller had already gained a reputation as one of the finest playwrights of his generation, thanks to classics such as All My Sons and Death of a Salesman. The two met on the set of the movie As Young as You Feel, and as Miller recalled it, when he first laid eyes on Monroe, she was crying.
Probably because of how ugly he is. No, I kid. She was actually crying about the death of her agent.
While the two quickly hit it off, a number of obstacles stood in their way. Miller was still married to his first wife, as was Monroe to Joe DiMaggio. And given that Monroe was one of the biggest stars of the screen at the time, her affairs were anything but discreet.
Also keeping them apart was the fact that Miller was ugly as sin. And to make matters worse for the homely buck, after the opening of his play The Crucible in 1954, which was inspired by Senator Joseph McCarthy's persecution of suspected communists, many began to think that Miller was a communist sympathizer himself. He was directly targeted by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC for short, which coincidentally was the same sound anyone made when they looked at his face. HUAC!
Okay, why do you keep calling him ugly?
I just really hated Death of a Salesman. It felt like it was written by an ugly person. Does that make sense?
Alright, well just try to keep it together. We're trying to have a mature conversation.
Don't worry, it'll all pay off later. Anyway, back to Horseface!
In 1956, Miller finally divorced his first wife, Mary Slattery, after 16 years of marriage. Coincidentally, around the same time, Monroe divorced her second husband, sending him back to the dugout.
With the two stars suddenly single, it freed them up to further pursue their relationship, which up to that point had only existed in letters. As one would imagine, a letter from Arthur Miller was more intellectually stimulating than a letter from Joe DiMaggio, who could only communicate in baseball terms. Strike three, Joe. This showed Monroe that taking on a more intelligent lover had its perks, and she began to fall for Miller's brain while he fell for her body.
Monroe felt that Miller understood her in a way that few other men did, picking up on the sadness behind her sexuality. He once remarked to her, "You're the saddest girl I've ever met," to which she responded, "You're the only one that's ever said that to me."
Miller was utterly infatuated with Monroe, and shockingly, she was infatuated with him, even converting to Judaism to appease Arthur's family. In 1956, the two wed and began their life together as husband and wife.
Monroe had begun to resent the trappings and tribulations of fame, and longed for a more domestic existence. But the star power of her and her husband made this impossible. Monroe's star continued to rise as she took roles in movies such as Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl, which improved her reputation as an accomplished actress. In 1958, however, she took an 18-month break from show business to focus more on married life with Arthur.
While this time should have brought the lovers closer together, instead it began to drive a wedge between them, as Monroe began to rely more and more on pharmaceuticals, and tragically suffered a miscarriage in 1957.
In 1960, Miller wrote the screenplay for the film The Misfits, which Monroe starred in. But throughout the filming process, their marriage continued to unravel, as Monroe's dependency on drugs caused her to have difficulty remembering the lines, and often made her unreliable on set.
Whether Arthur was unable or unwilling to help Marilyn, it was clear by the end of filming that their marriage was no longer working. The press viewed them as a mismatch, an intellectual and a bombshell. And while this assessment of Monroe may have been unfair, it's safe to say that the two started to internalize it, as both of them began to feel they were in over their heads.
In 1961, after 5 years of marriage, the two divorced. The Misfits was released the following month, where it flopped at the box office, making it an ironic parallel to their relationship.
If we've learned one thing from all this, it's that ugly people shouldn't be with pretty people. Keep them separated, that's what I say.
I concur.
Exactly. Wait, who's which? Who's which? Who's which?
In the months following their divorce, Monroe's dependency on drugs worsened due to heartbreak, the pressures of fame, and undiagnosed mental illness. In 1962, 19 months after she had separated from Miller, Monroe tragically died of a drug overdose.
2 years later, Miller wrote the play After the Fall, which is widely believed to be based on his marriage to Monroe. Views on the play are mixed, with some believing that Miller sharing so many intimate details was disrespectful to the deceased Monroe.
Soon after Monroe's death, Miller would marry Inga Morith, who he would stay with until her death in 2002. He died 3 years later, leaving behind a monumental legacy.
Wait, am I hearing you right? This guy got married 3 times? I can't even get a date to the sock hop, and this brick-faced commie is wedding broads left and right. So, Teddy, tell us about the song. Does it answer the mystery of how a man that ugly managed to wed one of history's greatest babes?
Well, Sam, as much as I hate to indulge your foolhardiness, it does.
I knew it.
This song, entitled I Guess There's Hope, centers around a fictionalized version of me in 9th grade, learning about the marriage of the two, and being as confused by it as our friend Sam was. After hearing about the tragic union, and all the heartbreak that came with it, my only response as a dumb 15-year-old is to rejoice at the thought that even a 3 like me could date a 10 like Marilyn. All it takes is becoming a great writer.
Wait a minute, so you're telling me I researched this couple for the past week, we just talked about them for 5 minutes, and the song isn't even about them? It's just some indulgent self-insert?
Yeah, pretty much.
How do you look at yourself in the mirror?
Easier than Arthur Miller does. For all you aspiring young uglies out there, just remember that you have a lot of pull if you got a Pulitzer.
And if you are one of Arthur Miller's descendants, we are so sorry.
Enjoy I Guess There's Hope.
Well, it was in my 9th grade English class that we learned of the playwrights of the past, Arthur Miller, and specifically the time he spent with Marilyn Monroe. After months of letters and hushed affairs to the tabloids, press, and lots of stares, they were married, Norma Jean and her new beau. But happy ever after was not to be. The second act skewed more towards tragedy. Come on, it's Miller, you know how these stories go. Sleeping with other celebrities, substance abuse, failed pregnancies, culminated in divorce and a drug overdose. And Arthur used their time as inspiration for his next Broadway play. The teacher asked, for what you've learned, what's your main takeaway? So I say, it gives me hope. Guess there's hope for us ugly guys. But Miss Monroe went home to him every night instead of some salivating jacked up dope. I guess there's hope. That smart dudes can land a knockout after all, excluding what went down after the fall. It gave me hope. And my classmates started saying, Teddy, just cause you're ugly doesn't mean that you're smart. Just because you've struck out with the ladies, that doesn't mean that you'll just make good art. Teacher said Arthur Miller was a genius. He wrote Death of a Salesman and other plays that I cannot name. Just because you're also an eyesore doesn't mean that you're remotely the same. And I said, well, friends, you may be absolutely correct. But I got a better shot at being like him than I do looking like Gregory Peck. So let me hope. Give some hope to us ugly guys. If she really loved that ball for eyes with commie ties, then let me emphasize there's hope. I guess there's hope for those of us who stay in and ride and never have a date on Friday nights. I guess there's hope. Who'd have thought that it could pay to ride? I guess there's hope. The great failed romances of the 20th century. Boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives. The great failed romances of the 20th century. Let's go hear about how they ruined their lives.